of literary text, and it's I am not worried about people who feel that reading graphic novel is culturally inferior to reading a book by Will Self or whatever. However, I do feel that the genre of graphic novel, and we can talk about that later, is on the decline. I mean, not in terms of marketing or in terms, it's just in terms of its sort of potential, its promise, its need, its cultural need, etc. It's perhaps in terms of content and form both. I feel it's not actually inventive enough. It's not self-interrogative enough. It's not drawing from other forms. It's just like limited to a small group of small readership, fairly conservative, and well, I could go on. I just don't want to but so we can get back to this topic eventually, and about content and what kind of work is happening in graphic novels, why it's not electric anymore.
Okay, well, we'll talk a little bit about that. But Mario, you have taught a class in graphic novels as well.
Yes,
and,
yes.
The series you've written is about a vampire detective. First of all, we do have to get you to tell the story about the first book in that series, The Nymphos of Rocky Flats.
Okay. Well, first of all, I want to thank everybody for being here today, and I'd like to thank the festival for inviting me here. It's a literary festival. Being a genre writer, they very seldom invite us to anything that has literary in it. But it is a pleasure and an honor to be here and to share the stage with Maeve and Sarnath. Well, the way I got started writing is that I had been trying to write a novel for a long time, and I first started writing literary novels, those kind of novels that would explain the world to you and that, and they were really kind of boring, and even when I would read them, I would fall asleep. And then I kind of gravitated toward the kind of books that I really like to read, which is more action, men's action stories. And I had one book, I'd write a book. I'd spend about 2 years writing it and sending out query letters and get rejections and stuff. And I had one novel number 6, that I thought was for sure going to get me published. I was positive, and I had everything all worked out, and had the agents and the query letter stuff. And I sent out the query letters. And I didn't even get so much as a rejection. It's like they wouldn't even bother to telling me that I sucked. They just left me alone. So then at that point I said, you know what, screw it. I'm going to write the most ridiculous story I can think about, which is about a vampire detective investigates an outbreak of nymphomania at Rocky Flats. And I ended up getting a 5-book deal out of that. So, it's just one of those things. And it's not write what you know, because I just pretty much invented a lot of it, but I had a lot of fun, and I got to explore a lot of the things that I liked, kind of put my arms around. There's a little bit of politics in it, and I love conspiracy theories, and a lot of hidden agendas. I love noir, so I got to work, and of course nymphomania. So I got to work all that in, and that was my foray into the publishing business.
Now, you alluded to the fact that you don't necessarily get invited to many literary festivals.
That's correct.
Being the genre of writing that you do, albeit you've been to one already today, coming up from Pueblo, from the Literature Festival. And that, I suppose, goes back to what we were speaking with Sarnath, in terms of what role in society or culture do your genre of books. You have done a graphic novel. This is a series with a vampire as a detective in it. Do you feel that you're relegated to the Comic-Con crowd, that you're kind of missing out on a wider audience?
I don't actually like to think about that too much. What I like to think about is when I'm dead for about 10 years, people come back and read my books and like, oh my God, he was really exploring, dissecting the American culture in a way no one else did. And I'll be like Raymond Chandler. It's like we often say that a genre writer doesn't get any respect till he's been dead for about 40 years. And then like Mickey Spillane and Raymond Chandler, and then they go back and say, oh, there was this subtext going on. But that's we'll wait and see. We'll wait and see.
Well, why vampires? Vampires are so enduring in genre literature, in young adult literature, in popular culture in general. Why do you think vampires have captured so many people's imagination and still do?
Well, for me, it was all just me pulling something out of the air, and because I had been talking to Maeve before, and that growing up, I did not like vampires. I thought the whole thing was silly. You know, a lot of the conventions where, you know, you shoot a vampire with a gun, that didn't work. But if you hit it with a stick or something, that would work. And I think that didn't make any sense to me. And then if you knew where the vampire was, why don't you just blow up the crypt? You know, I mean, I just did just a lot of that. So then when I decided to write that book, part of the reason that made me want to write about vampires is that I had read, I don't know if you guys know who Charlene Harris is, the True Blood on TV. She had written the book that the series is based on called, the first book was called Dead Until Dark. And I had read a very good review about that book. So I went and read it. And that was the first and really the only vampire book that I read cover to cover. And I really liked it because there were no rules, and she just, you know, about fantasy, and she just made them up. And she also looked into the kind of the humorous aspects of if you really were involved with a vampire and the undead. And like her vampire Bill was a Civil War veteran, and at night he could come out, but in the daytime he had to go bury himself in the ground. So when he woke up, you know, he had to wash and, you know, clean all the maggots and stuff out of his clothes and things. And you're like, well, of course, right? So that's what really made me think about writing about a vampire and a vampire detective and just sort of run off in that direction.
Well, Sarnath, getting back to you and your work as not just a graphic novelist, you're also a publisher of graphic novels. Right. When you wrote your first book, Corridor, and I mean, what reality were you bringing that forth in? I mean, are you coming from a culture in India where there's a long history and appreciation of graphic novels? Maybe like you could compare Japan, which has a really deep-rooted history in manga and graphic novels there. I mean, what was the literature world like for you when you were first writing your first graphic novel?
Nobody had any idea.
I mean, did you have to explain yourself what this was and why you were doing it?
Well, years of colonialism, you know, made us sort of privy to understanding things and forms better if they have been already established abroad, unfortunately. So you had to like sort of, you know, rattle off names, and people still do critiques that, you know, somebody has written this novel about this particular place and that kind of politics, and it has been in like New Yorker list, and you had to like push your agenda by, it's rather humiliating, and you have to like sort of constantly sort of say things that, you know, this is going to work, that is going to work. Yeah, same experience in Mario, very difficult to get it published, and finally when I did get published by Penguin, strangely enough, I've always had these eccentric editors who've sort of, they wouldn't like to be called genre-defying people because they're very quiet and like understated people, so they just sort of, you know, it published it on a whim, and I think it probably did all right, not embarrassingly, and but I mean, people had been writing comic books and graphic novels. My colleague Arijit Sen, also a good friend, wrote a book on activism, like about building a particular dam in India, and he, it was probably not self-described. It didn't describe itself as a graphic novel, but it was an adult comic book about activism, about a group of people trying to save a river from dying, and all the stories that are built around. And some of these stories were like indigenous stories, beautiful stories, oral stories. So yeah, there was people, and there were of course the other kind of, you know, the usual children's stuff, the historical stuff. So we did come from, but I didn't, did you ask me about my publishing house? Because I thought you started the question about the publishing house and whether there was a need for a publishing house. Well,
that was going to be my next question is, right, you know, given your experience trying to publish your own graphic novel, was that one of the reasons that you decided to set up your own publishing house, publishing graphic novels?
Oh, absolutely not, because I am petrified by self-published, there's fantastic stuff that can only happen when there's independent publication, but I myself have always been a bit nervous about self-publishing. I wouldn't publish my own comic books. I mean, I need validation of sorts, that whether it's... So
you don't publish your own stuff?
No, I don't publish my own stuff. I only publish other people. And I did that fundamentally to... sort of deal with the sort of situation where you had commentators. It's not by any means a nationalistic project, but then you've always had commentators coming from elsewhere who would take a politics that you either live or engender and comment about it for a readership which likes the checklisting of things. So you either affirm to, say, a European point of view of what, say, Sri Lanka is or India is, or you go against it. Either ways, you deal with the confirmation. You either conform or reject a thought which already exists within the Western canon. And I thought that it's almost as if your book is successful in India, then it mustn't be successful in America, because there are two different paradigms which these things, one tries to universalize issues, make it more universal, make it more accessible to a readership which is not, and one is very local, and one is very sort of willfully local kind of a thing. So there was always this dilemma, and Phantomville, my publishing house, was trying to get some of these stories out which actually was sort of like an early morning in Karachi, for example, or sort of a Kashmiri. You can call him a freedom fighter or a militant, his interview, things which might, very banal, which might or might not interest your agent in New York because it's outside his sort of, so we just thought that I would just bring in these collaborations of usually between journalists or theorists or whatever, architects, and make them work with someone who draws, an artist, and see what comes out of it. That was the whole point of the whole exercise.
Well, you mentioned accessibility and how is it maybe the Western paradigm that graphic novels are maybe making subject matter more accessible to a wider audience. Maybe some of that political stuff you mentioned, your friend who'd done a graphic novel about a dam issue. I mean, we're seeing a history of that, whether it's Mouse or Persepolis about Iran, Joe Sacco and Palestine. I mean, do you think that there's a real role for graphic novels to enter into that space to create accessibility over these topics that, many people maybe just don't want to take the time, but just don't have that connection to? It's a difficult topic, maybe.
Reading a picture book is a complex process. So people who think that it's easy to read a graphic novel, if you want to use that word, is perhaps in some danger of being disappointed, because some of the very good graphic novels is they're compositions. Words and pictures are composed in clever ways to. I'm sure Mario will tell you more about that, because to not really actually to achieve things that either of them can't achieve in itself. So either creating an atmosphere or a sense or a complex argument, or comics is this great diagrammatic value, of having the whole kind of describing this whole sort of auditorium all in a single page where everybody's. So it has all these sort of grammatical aspects of comic book which only a comic book can do. It's not about just simplifying the life of I don't know, Olaf Palme or United Nation, or explaining sort of complex things, or what is Anthropocene, what is global climate problem. I mean, it could be perhaps one role of comic books to kind of explain things. It is also one of the roles of comic books to kind of make things very complex. Simple things can be made very complicated, as you yourself mentioned, Japanese situation. You can sort of see all the moments existing in the same plane, and that's within the engineering of comics. You can achieve that. So when you said accessibility, I might say something very controversial. I was just an overproduction of the Western thinking. So a French artist talks about Burma or Korea. And the value system is fundamentally the French value system, or whatever, French-Canadian value system of one's own idea of democracy, or one's own idea of the books that one has read, etc. So this sort of value system, so it's almost seemed that the West can only appreciate something when it's written from the point of view of someone who's Western, even though there are other people who could locally unfold it much in a marginalized. Whereby I do completely agree that sometimes an outsider's point of view can be phenomenally interesting, and I mean, a culture can only become richer when an outsider can. But a constant banging on about this sort of Eurocentric notions, you know, on a society which has its own sort of fine sort of culture of advertisements, humor, magazines, you know, which had its own. And I feel that all the time, the way I live in Berlin, and I see how Berlin is perceived, West Berliners perceived East Berliners, these sort of, you know, stereotypes about the East Berliners. But feminism reached a very high point within East Berlin. But it's very difficult to kind of deal with the Western press. But I mean, this is all complicated stuff. So I'll leave there and I'll let it be there.
Well, Mario, you've taught a class in graphic novels.
Yes, yes.
I mean, which comes first? The story, the text, the pictures? Are they can you actually extract any of those elements, or do they all have to come forth almost in tandem?
Well, they all have to be integrated, and it's interesting in that class I learned in preparing for the class as the instructor. Also, I learned quite a bit of things that I thought I knew, but then having to articulate them to the students, and I had to do a lot of studying on my own, and the integration and how far back the idea of blending words and pictures goes back, like to the murals in ancient Egypt. There was the blending of text and pictures. So the Romans did a lot. The Trajan column, for example, are some of the older examples. But it's extremely sophisticated. The Japanese manga, especially, is very sophisticated in their integration of text and story, and in the representation of the individual. In that it can change from panel to panel. You can have a very realistic-looking individual, and then when they express something, they become very cartoony, and they can move back and forth that way. And then also the way some of the advantages of a graphic novel or comics is they can move time, they blend time in ways that is very difficult in other mediums to do without getting confused. And it's a way of making certain points in combining words and in the text, and it's very sophisticated. I mean, people think, oh, it's just pictures and a few words rather than these big long blocks of text. But the blending of the two is its own art, and it is very an effective medium in its own right to project whatever idea you want.
And do you think that medium gives you more freedom to explore issues that maybe are more political in nature, or maybe harder to digest if you were just doing a text?
No, I don't think so. I mean, every particular medium, film, for example. Or video, radio, social media, novels, or nonfiction. They all have their own strengths, and that all depends on the messages you want to do. Today, I was talking down at the Latino Art Festival, and I was talking about fiction, and then how I write fiction, and fiction is a lie. So I'm a professional liar. Is what I am. But what fiction allows us to do is explore the what-ifs that you can't do in nonfiction, because then it becomes fiction. And it also allows you to distill the narrative into one particular point that you want, which would be hard to do in nonfiction, because in nonfiction you have to take a look at everything, and you could be accused of leaving something out if you didn't do it right. So,
who is your audience?
Who's what?
Who's your audience? Who's your
anybody
readership?
Who reads. I do not think of a particular audience.
Do you have a specific demographic? Are you getting letters from?
No, I don't have that. I was at a book signing one time, and this young woman came up to me. She goes, because the novels of the titles of my novels, The Nymphos of Rocky Flats, X-Rated Bloodsuckers, The Undead Kama Sutra, and that. So this young woman comes up to me, and she says, I turned 13 today, and my mom said I could buy your book. So I'm like, okay, cool. That's great. But then I had somebody else come in and say, I bought some of your books, and I left them at my house. My mom came over. She's 81 years old. She loves your books. And you know, she just, for her birthday, she wants your next book. So, you know, I don't want to guess in any direction, you know, who would read it, or I would like everybody to read it, actually, is what the long answer, or the short answer.
And yourself, what about, do you have an audience that you know about, or a constituency that's, you know, very loyal to your graphic novels, or the ones that you publish?
No.
No. Across the board? I mean, you have used the term comic books and graphic novels interchangeably. I mean, is there a difference between the two, and is there a preference over which term?
I think in the industry, a comic book would be the short, like the chapter, the episode, which is generally 19 to 21 pages, but then they're combined together, and anything over, let's say, 47, I don't know why 47 pages was the shortest I could find, that would say, okay, then at that point it's a transition from a comic to a graphic novel. But, so if you go to the comic book store, right? I mean, that's what they don't call it the graphic novel store, they call it the comic book store, because you're looking for the individual comics, remember, like the Superman or Batman, which is 19 to 21 pages. But if you combine those, usually those are a particular story arc that would go from maybe 5 to 10 comics, and then that would be a graphic novel, because it is a complete story that way. But, you know, other people would just, particularly in other venues, they would say, well, I'm doing a 10-page graphic novel. So it's really, you know, however you want to identify that.
Sarnath, do you have a preference over which term?
No.
No. Short answers. Short answer.
It's a long, pointless conversation, actually, graphic novel and comic book, and I think a lot of people have spent a lot of energy trying to kind of define. And I think Mario, the way he explained it was absolutely perfect. There's an industry understanding of what graphic novel is, and personal understanding of graphic novel. Picture books.
Picture book.
Okay. You mentioned earlier that you see limitations in the medium, that there are issues. Could you maybe explore that a little bit more?
The limitations, as I was early this morning, I went for a little walk with my friend Jeremy, came down from Denver, and we were like talking about comic books, and we were having a nice cup of coffee at Cafe Oz, I think.
Ozo?
Ozo, yes, that's the one. Look at Japanese sounding, very nice coffee. And we were like sitting in the sun and discussing the huge crisis that we feel, both of us felt, that graphic novels are having. And we felt mostly at least I felt like mostly that, you know, a lot of it is self-imposed. A lot of questioning that could have happened within the form is not being, certain questions not being asked. Like I'm influenced by radio, for example, what you do. Like, I mean, a lot of my, I think you mentioned and you asked that question whether comic books are a better way to understand. And I completely agree with you that it is one way of understanding something. It's certainly not a better way of understanding anything particular. I mean, totally agree with you. Every medium has its own. I mean, ukulele has its own place, and so does the cello. So I just feel that there's there isn't. I forgot your question. Sorry.
Well, we're talking about the limitation.
Sorry.
Very good.
I heard a sound.
You talked earlier
sensitive.
about the limitations of the medium, and you said it's rather self-inflicted. And so,
well, content-wise, there's a limitation. You sort of see a lot of, like, my friend Jeremy actually told me about the kind of general trend of comic books that is coming up with. There's a lot of queer politics, for example, coming from Chicago. This is entirely what I learned this morning. A lot of exploration of queer politics that is happening in Chicago. There's a lot of exploration of a sort of pared down style that is happening from some other place. The different kind of schools of comic books that are developing. Content-wise, you see a lot of like these sort of self-referent, like what do you call it, autobiographical comics. I mean, you get to hear about like the people continuously bang on about their like little lives in like Toronto. I mean, it's great. I mean, phenomenal, like, split ups and taking a tram back home and, crumple tickets and movies and nostalgia and all that kind of stuff. I mean, come on, give us a break. I mean, there's like other things happening in the world. There's Syria, there's phenomenal like stuff. Like human beings are progressing in all sorts of exploring different directions. Give us some of that. I'd like to know what happens in Zanzibar. Like, you know, a day in life of like, it's just like so. And yeah. Sorry.
Well, we're seeing that a little bit. I mean, Joe Sacco writing about Palestine, Marion Satrapi writing about being Iranian, you know, in Europe. I mean, there's definitely some of that, but
I mean,
not enough. Is that what you're saying?
I'll hold back. Joe Sacco's Palestine was, of course, a phenomenally important comic book, and of course, its importance has not escaped the publishing world because it's continuously similar kind of comic books that are coming out of this sort of graphic reportage where someone goes and like, you know, just give them a country and he'll just like, you know, crack it up like, you know, I'm sure there'll be like a sort of, you know, Joe Sacco in like Kabul, Joe Sacco in, I mean,
Zanzibar,
yeah, or wherever. No, but I mean, this is, I'm just obviously, I mean, I'm a great admirer of Joe's work, phenomenal. But I just feel like that the method is just, it's not just that, it's just also like the politics that comes with it. His politics is fine, so I don't know what I'm talking about. I should shut up.
At the same time, when you're talking about maybe the medium being a bit self-limiting in terms of, you know, what's being produced, what about the market? I mean, is this a growing arena where we're seeing more and more people actually wanting comic books and graphic novels? So are we seeing two things happening at the same time?
Well, I'll be honest with you. I'm just like really concerned about the local market, Indian market, maybe South Africa, maybe Pakistan, maybe sort of that kind of market. I don't really, I mean, I'm slightly suspicious of like books that cross over really well. Like, you know, everybody, like people are like sort of absolutely amazed in Dusseldorf about what you've written. Or, you know, you have to like basically make a choice, I feel. Or maybe it's my own limitations that, you know, when I write, I sort of have some kind of, you know, so I lied to you. I said that I don't have an audience in mind, but I do probably have an audience in mind. So yeah, sometimes it crosses over. I don't like explaining things too much. This is Wikipedia, for God's sakes.
Okay.
I mean,
well, Mario, your genre, I suppose you're in the vampire detective genre.
Yes.
I'm not sure how big that genre is, but I mean, do you see that in any way limiting, or is it limitless? I mean, given the fact that it is fantasy, you can just keep going for years. Is that the plan?
What's funny to me is that Sarnath talks about his audience in Dusseldorf, and I can talk about my audience in Commerce City. So anyway, so the limiting, you know, it is. Even within the genre community, it gets divided. For example, there's other literary or I guess cons that I've gone to. One of them is BullshitCon, which is the big mystery writing convention, and the other one is International Thriller Writers, another big convention. And it's hard for me to get traction there because a traditional mystery writer wants that hardback traditional mystery story, and if you have like one drop of fantasy element in it, they're like, okay, it's something else, I'm not going to read that. So that's that aspect of it. Sometimes even within the science fiction community, they want the hard science. If there's any kind of a fantasy element in it, they're like, well, that's not science fiction, it's fantasy now, which is true. But to me, it's exploring the big what ifs. I find that I think the two of all the genres are the two that are most welcoming to reading anything, or the fantasy and romance writers. If you really want to make a lot of money, you find something that romance writers want to read. They are the most voracious of all readers, and they read all genres. Okay, they do not just read romance; they read all genres, and they spend a lot of money on that. So that's good. Romance, yeah. If you can get the romance readers on your side, and that's work, because I've gone to romance writing conventions, and they are very. They'll have a panel on literary, you know, the literary aspects of romance writers and that. And I've gone there and met a lot of wonderful people, and then of course there's the local cons, like we have Mile High Con, and then there's Bubonic Con, named after the bubonic plague, and that's in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and it's called the Bubonic Con because at first it was called the New Mexico Science Fiction Convention, and then one of the guys who helped start it went to Egypt, and they looked at his passport and they said, "Oh, you're from New Mexico?" And he goes, "Yeah." And it goes, "We can't let you in our country because you have the bubonic plague in New Mexico. Like they don't have the plague in Egypt, I guess." And they said no, so they wouldn't let him in the country. So he went back to Albuquerque and he told a story there. So they're like, "Okay, we're going to rename the con the bubonic con after that." So yeah, so
you are really genre spanning. You're going to romance.
Yeah, well, yeah, they call they I'm trying to think of the term on that. Cross genre is the industry term for that. And you know, there's strengths and bads. You know, and like, you know, anything that you write, any particular genre that you write, it comes and it kind of crests and then it goes down and then it could lay dormant. And people come up to me and goes, "Oh, you wrote a vampire book at the perfect time for vampires," and I'm like, I just pulled it out of my ass. Is really what I did, you know. And it just happened to be the right time. And so, you know, there's the different trends ebb and flow, and really no one can predict, because they keep saying, for example, vampires are dead, we're done, and then somebody writes a book and they'll make like $40 million, right? And that.
Well, I'd like to open it up to the audience if anybody has any questions. We do have a lady there. Do we have a microphone? There we go.
Yes, for Sarnath. I heard you talk about how you were tired of the Eurocentric viewpoint, and I was wondering if you had ever thought about publishing a graphic novel using a contemporary story with the indigenous style of art form, you know, like Indian, like, you know, the company style, or patta chitra, or even miniature. Are there any things like that in the works in your publishing company?
Yeah, although I did actually make a strong case for like local idiom, I'm myself very Eurocentric. Sort of.
We live in Berlin.
I've like grown up on Blake and Hogarth and all that sort of stuff. So I have not really actually seen Pottochitra till it was actually appropriated by the West, strangely. So that's a confession. Having said that, there's no dearth of Indian publishers who are not using the age-old sort of traditional methods to kind of, you know, tell contemporary stories. It's become a bit of a fashion, actually. So the authorship is usually with like the publisher who writes something, and then they go around looking for some local artist to kind of get a local idiom. And then just so then you know, they bang out a whole bunch of locally looking, authentic, with like fantastically sort of contemporary stories. And it's actually a trope. But I'm just saying that there's no immediate danger of local forms disappearing in India or in Pakistan. Except they've been appropriated rather strangely and not very naturally in most cases. There are some cases where people have actually had sort of natural stuff. So having said, creating like such a strong case for like local stuff, I also kind of want to also sort of be fairly critical about it, and people also use the sort of self-exotification. So it's almost too difficult to kind of, you know, it's too tempting to not do it. So that's all right.
Any other questions?
Speechless.
They're speechless. We're speechless. We've covered everything. Well, I'm sorry, we do.
So you're talking about graphic novels earlier and manga. What graphic novels and manga have inspired you in your work, and why? Anybody who wants to take it.
Because Sarnath, you said when you were going to publishing houses, you had to explain, well, look at all of these great graphic novels. I mean, what were they and what were your inspiration?
Right. A lot of them are American, of course. Edward Gorey was not a graphic novel, but like a pictorial text. Joe Sacco, of course. I mean, he was the reason why I started Phantomville, to get sort of journalists to actually contemplate using visuals to create a sense of atmosphere and argument and marginalia, which is all the things that happen around the story that kind of, you know, makes the story like richer. So, Joe Sacco, phenomenally important. Then I already mentioned Blake. I mean, I'm now going back to sort of 17th century, but sort of chapbooks that used to come in England, which are like Penny Dreadfuls and things like that. I mean, it's not graphic novel for me, it's pictorial text. So moment I say graphic novel, that I'm, like sort of a small group like Watchmen, or did you mention Arch Spiegelman? Yeah, Arch Spiegelman. And, I feel like it's kind of self-limiting. I'd like to open it up, like Mario talked about cross-genre sort of a thing. So all kinds of pictorial books that have existed have been sort of source material for my work, or my inspiration. I like Daniel Klaus very much, having said all that. Yeah. There are others. I can't remember. Right
Mario,
now.
You mentioned the writer that got you into vampires. Who's your inspiration around graphic novels, comic books?
Well, graphic novels, I've always been more drawn to the illustrative aspect of them. And there was one particular illustrator who's since passed away, Jack Kirby, who really changed the look of comic books. He works with Marvel comics, and I've always enjoyed that, and in fact, I've had kind of a renewed appreciation of his influence on not just the visual style, but on the storytelling, because they would integrate. He worked with Stan Lee, and they would integrate the story aspect of it. I mean, there's just a lot of just a lot of Frank Frazetta. I don't know. He's the guy from Conan. He did the book covers from Conan, and it's just the way that they have been able to capture that evocative feeling of this kind of a very hard-boiled look, and a lot of put in a lot of that tension and that drama into their artwork, and I've always thought it would be very interesting or that'd be my goal, is to try to put that in my prose, to have that. To evoke that kind of feeling from my reader, that the way they evoke that as me as viewing their artwork, and this real fantasy aspect to it.
So Sarnath mentioned Shahnama, and then I was thinking about Blake. So if you, I wanted to know what's the golden proportion between the text and the illustration. So in Blake, the poems, from songs of innocence and experience, they're really short. And so the illustrations kind of work together. And with Shahnama, the text itself is, thousands of lines. And then the illustrations are just the most famous episodes in there. So is there in your graphic novels a ratio that you try to follow, a golden proportion between text and image?
Very interesting question. There are many ways to answer this question. I mean, I don't, the quick answer is that I don't have it's very instinctive, and it's like, again, I'll get into the compositional part of, like, if you're like composing a piece of music, it's very difficult to kind of, decide on the octaves and the notes and things like that, pre-decide on that. You just play the piano a little bit, and then you write a little bit, and that sort of works, and then you've written something that kind of works. Sometimes you've written something and you play it instead of, it's absolute shite. So you don't really, so it kind of, it develops slowly, and then what happens is just like an entire body of work. I suppose that's how at least I work, and play at, that's
so
how.
Blakean ratios, then you're with Blake then, like with text verses, I mean, do you end up writing more text?
In The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, I would imagine he drew and wrote at the same time. You just sort of see that sort of that absolute energy in writing.
For real? You really think? Or
I think.
Yeah. Oh, so he was like the first comic writer then?
Possibly he was like writing away like we do in Notebook. Notebooks are like sort of, playing fields, where you are trying out different things. I suspect, I wasn't there, but I have a feeling that he could have possibly have written sort of in a compositional style, but one of the things which you also, I mean, it's also about reading images. You know, images also need, a culture needs to know how to read images, and sometimes the literary types find that difficult to actually understand. I'm not blaming literary types, I'm being one myself. I prefer a book to a graphic novel, to be honest, often. But, heresy. But, there's a phenomenal divide of literacy of images, you know, and you often see that within these literary places, festivals, that there's a general lack of understanding of how to read images. And luckily for us, there is a population which also knows how to read images, and that kind of keeps us afloat, I suppose. Otherwise, we'll all like write rather descriptive, atmospheric.
But we are out of time. I'd like to thank everyone for coming.